Welcome, everyone. This is Vishaka Sant. I lead the healthcare, life sciences, and payer ecosystem here at ServiceNow. Welcome to the webinar where we're talking about CMS mandated timelines for grievances and appeals. They're tightening in the ecosystem. And we, as healthcare organizations and constituents, are compressed to look at what are the windows of opportunity that payer organizations have to actually manage grievances and appeals across disconnected systems. I'm joined here with Milind and Alexi, and we are going to talk through really setting some groundwork before we get started. Two terms you're going to hear throughout this session are grievances and appeals. And in doing this session, I've learned that those are actually two very different processes. Grievances are formal complaints, appeals are formal requests to decisions that have been made. And there's a reason why this conversation is so urgent now. In 2024, Medicare Advantage insurers processed 53 million prior authorization requests and denied 4.1 million of them. That's a 7.7% denial rate. Of those denials, 11.5% were appealed, but only of the ones that were, 80% were overturned. And physicians, they complete an average of 39 prior authorizations per week, spending about 13 hours on the process. So let's just sit with that for a moment. 4 out of 5 appeals succeed, but almost nobody appeals. And that's not a coverage problem. That truly is a systems problem. And a systems problem sits at the intersection of compliance, operations, member services, and clinical review. So today we're going from complexity to clarity with the right people. I have Milind Shah. Milind, as a point of this, ServiceNow is well known for IT and HRSD in the payer ecosystem, or in just in general. That's where we were born out of. What is ServiceNow doing in the payer ecosystem as it lends itself to making steps in AI and workflows and bringing data and workflow together?
Yeah, Vishaka, thank you very much. And firstly, before I start, just quickly want to say three thank yous as a part of kicking this off. Firstly, thank you to all the participants and all the folks that are taking the time out for this hour. Hopefully, most importantly, to have this dialogue, to have this connection for where we can all talk about the pains and the things that we all suffer with within this healthcare industry, but most importantly, learn from one another and share ideas. And hopefully, through that, we look forward to sharing some of what we're up to with an amazing partner in Keenstack, who we're lucky to have Ellipses here, who will introduce himself in a second. But thank you mostly to the folks that are here. You know, I always say coming and growing up in playing sports, was in varsity tennis and basketball. Healthcare is a team sport, so it takes all of us to transform this industry and to really innovate. And so, looking forward to the dialogue, looking forward to the opportunity. The chat is open, so we look forward to anyone that wants to ask any questions to do that through kind of that medium. And Ellipses and I will be as good as we can with any technology challenges to kind of monitor that and make sure that we make this a fluid discussion. Secondly, I want to thank Ellipses and having an amazing partner like Keenstack lean in with us on this area and take the time with us today to kind of share what we're both seeing within this space and some opportunities we feel like of where we can help. And Vishaka, thirdly, thank you to you for hosting this forum and to the team behind the scenes that helps in setting all these things up. We wouldn't be where we are and having these kind of amazing opportunities without having you guys. And so thank you to you guys as well. As Vishaka mentioned, Milind and Shah have the privilege of leading up the payer industry here with inside of ServiceNow, intersection of product strategy, go to market, and really focusing on strategic partnerships with amazing companies like Keenstack and others. You know, what's important to us, Vishaka, and kind of answering your question is there's a lot of opportunity we see in leveraging our platform, which if you think of what it is just anatomically, right, it's really good at managing tasks, right? That's what ServiceNow is just set up to do structurally, to really lean in and take the opportunity of helping and transforming in core payer domain spaces above and beyond what we're already privileged to do with a large install base in the payer community in areas like IT and HR and others, which are absolutely important and core to where we're going as a company. But the value in extending that platform to core domain areas allows you to do even more. And so we're privileged to be leaning in areas, for example, like claims transformation. One of those areas we'll be talking about today, right, which is appeals and grievances. But outside of that, in areas like claims exception handling, as well as fraud, waste, and abuse, in areas like provider data management and thinking about onboarding, credentializing, as well as in looking at things like the infamous roster or directory, we call it within the payer world. And then in areas like care management, disease management, right? Where if you think of the non-clinical piece of that, the entire process from identifying, stratifying, coordinating, planning, it's all rich workflow. And in all these places, I've had the privilege prior to ServiceNow of being a practitioner, I call it, within the industry. I was at Elevance, ran strategy for 4 years, was at Humana prior to that, and before that was at Deloitte servicing large payers. Of seeing on the other side the complexities we've created within this industry of where we're all trying to do the best we can and try to make a difference, where there's actually opportunity to lean in with modern technology and especially AI native capabilities and just alleviating some of that burden. And we'll absolutely dive into that specifically for appeal and grievances today. But we look forward to the opportunity to sharing broader what we're doing within this space, because this is absolutely an area for ServiceNow that we'd be privileged and honored to partner with anyone on. But it's an area, Vishaka, to your point, that we're actually set up to do from what we do as just being good at managing tasks, which all these things are.
Yeah,
So that'll
and
hand
I
it back.
think that's really core is that ServiceNow has always been our basic unit of work is task, and task happens across the payer enterprise. And ServiceNow has been born out of service management and now is natively in AI, but we can't go about it alone. And so we have Lefsy here, who is Keenstack is definitely one of the more progressive platforms and players that are actually making a difference in this space. So, Lefsy, do you mind talking a little bit more about yourself, introducing yourself, and what Keenstack does?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Vishaka, and thanks, Milton, for having me on today. So, Keenstack is a build and consulting and implementation partner for ServiceNow. And the build part today is really one of the most important things that we're doing, and that we're building solutions or products that can be brought directly into payer and provider organizations to help address some of these key issues or key workflows. And one thing I wanted to point out is that, prior to joining Keenstack, I spent 10 years at Banner Health, was the VP of Infrastructure and Operation, where I managed the platform ServiceNow. And prior to that, I worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield. But one of the things that I think that I found is that, the IT teams in both in payer and provider organizations are kind of hogging ServiceNow. They found this secret sauce where they can use a tool that is fantastic at workflows, has agentic capabilities baked into it, and they're using it to service their own internal needs as well as, the traditional IT services. And the one thing that kind of gets lost in the mix is the application of this same powerful platform into business use cases. And so often you find enterprise architects or other business entities are like, well, how do we solve this problem? It's like, well, we need to go stitch together an RPA tool and an AI tool, and we need to stitch together, our data infrastructure. And what they don't look all the time is like the tools that IT has been using for years to solve these similar types of challenges, and just shifting the paradigm and the lens and applying that directly to business use cases, like one example being appeals and grievances, which is just, again, we talk about, Vishaka hit on a great point early on that 53 million prior auth requests in 2024. The last number that I had from 2019, that was a 35% increase, right? And so if you think about that, what's happening up to 2026, 2025, not only is there more volume moving through the pipe is also getting wider, because as people start to understand that they're winning 80% of the time, you're going to have more and more of that volume. You're going to see just the total population of who's going to be submitting appeals increase. And that the funny thing is the 4.1 million denials and the 470,000 actual appeals that are generated for that only represent 11.5% of the total denials. So this is a monster that's hiding in the closet. That's kind of waiting to kind of break out. And I think it's an important topic to broach today.
I fully agree. And I would love your point of view, Millen, on what Alexi is saying related to grievances and appeals. What are you seeing out there in terms of current state and what optimization? Where are the opportunities here?
Yeah, and Ellipses, I'm sure you have some of these, war stories, so feel free to lean in here as I talk about this as well, right? But I'll take off my service and hat off for a second and talk about this from the privilege I had at Elevance and managing transformation and strategy. And this was one of the areas we focused a lot on, even in Humana, frankly, since Medicare is a robust area. Ellipses, I'm sure, is you'd agree in kind of where this dynamic exists from prior auths and appeals and grievances. What's interesting is, and I joke about this all the time, one of my goals in life is when I retire, in the box of things that I take back home, hopefully one of the things I'm going to take back home is a fax machine. Because what's funny about our industry, right? And it's funny, I was talking to my kids a couple of days ago. I have a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old, and we are talking about like iPods and other things. And I was explaining to them, like things that happen in our business and healthcare and like how we do things. Like, wait, you guys still send paper? You guys actually still send documents over this thing that looks like it's a copy machine or it's a printer, but you call it a fax machine? We're still an industry in even the most robust enterprises, right, such as Elevance, who is the second largest payer. And you can think about this from the provider end as well, right? For some of these health systems, Vishaka, that are like very large, that we have just complicated the system in some of the most basic areas because we're still very legacy, right? And so take, for example, the most simple thing like how you actually do an appeal and grievance. Yes, there's modern tech and there's portals and there's all these other ways that we started creating, right, for how you can digitize and leverage modern tech, right, to be able to have those communications. But at Elevance, for example, even at Humana, the largest channel of communication between a provider and a payer was a fax machine.
Hmm.
And if it wasn't a fax machine, it was a phone call. And those were lucky, right? Because then the provider or the member is actually taking the time to pick up the phone and argue with the payer, like, I don't agree with this, decision on this prior auth. I want it to be overturned or whatever it might be, right? But those don't happen often because everyone knows how long those take. And so starting from just the core roots of this process, if you will, right? From how we do the intake, which has a 2 to 3 day loss because of the fact that we use this legacy technology, to then how we actually do the evidence and the gathering. As a product person, one of the things I always get the privilege to do is actually do these what I call ride-alongs or sit-alongs with people, right? To understand what is your day in the life and what are the things you're going through before we say, ta-da, we have technology and we can solve for this because technology has to be useful. It's not forceful, right, in helping with these kind of things, and it has to be delightful. And so one of the things you'd be surprised to see when you're actually sitting down with, let's say, a clinical nurse or an L1, L2 person that's helping deal with these kind of appeals and grievances is the amount of time, and I'll take the UM nurse as an example, who, by the way, is an actual nurse, right? They've gone to school, they're actually in the practice to do medicine. They are spending about 40 to 50% of their time in the beginning of their day in, let's call, uh, discovering or understanding the case that they have to deal with in doing nothing other than administrative stuff. I got to go
Mhm.
look up the benefits and understand it. I have to go look at the guidelines and understand it. I have to look at 300 pages of documentation the provider has sent me for why this lab or why this test or whatever and understand it before I can even put my clinical hat on and do the job that I'm supposed to be doing for the member that's waiting there on the other side, right? That's already now had a 2 to 3 day lag because I've gotten this thing through a fax machine instead of through a
Yeah.
digital form, and actually then have to make a decision, right? And that's just, by the way, the front end of the process, right? And that piece we call in this space, evidence gathering and research, right? And so if we actually think about it, there's just so much low-hanging fruit operationally
Hmm.
in the way things are done today in 2026, when Netflix on TV tells me every day what I have to watch and I don't even have to think about it, for how we can just apply that to healthcare, right? And obviously something like this space of appeal and grievances. And that's not even getting into the fun and exciting stuff and transformative stuff yet, right? It's
Yeah.
just the basic things. Right. And so I think even if we start there, which is not sexy, which is not appealing, but it's the necessary evil, I call it, right? And kind of fixing some of the blocking and tackling that's important to then get to those other more interesting areas, we will have absolutely made a difference. We'll make a difference for the bottom line of a company. We'll more importantly make a difference for that member and also, frankly, for that provider who's in this equation as the middleman trying to just figure things out. And so I think that's where our opportunity is to start.
Yeah, I agree with you. And funny, I wanted to contextualize this for people maybe in an industry where they don't even, if you took the appeals and grievance process today for that you're having with the payer and you applied it to the pizza industry. So to give you an example of what this probably looks like. So you're going to go on a Domino's website and you're going to download a web form, right, a form, and you're going to fill out your order, the toppings, the pizza, what you want. And you're going to snap a picture of it on your phone, you know, and then you're gonna send it over either you're gonna send it over back to Domino's via email, or maybe you're gonna use the most innovative thing in the world called eFax, where you're just sending it to basically an inbox. And then after that, you have no idea what happens. You don't know when the pizza is going to show up. You don't know if they got your order. You have no idea what's going on. And eventually, maybe it shows up. Maybe someone comes at your door and here's the pizza, and maybe it's wrong. That's effectively like no one would order pizzas if that's what the process was. And I think it's interesting that now you have more insight from the point you order a pizza to when they make it, when they put it in the oven, when they quality check it, and when it shows up to your door. You can even see where the driver's at on the way to your front door. That is the expectation that members have when it comes to service and how insight that they have and communication that they get versus what when they carry that over to these processes like appeals and grievances. All of a sudden they're like, what's wrong here? This is my healthcare, this is my life. I have a tumor that I want to get. I have a prior auth, right, that was denied to get a biopsy on a tumor in my thyroid, and I don't even know what's going on, but they can tell me how many pepperoni they put on my pizza at 10:30. I just think it's fundamentally flawed, and it's not a technology problem from my perspective because the technology exists. It's really more about why are we not adopting these solutions and these tools that have been picked up in the pizza industry and not in healthcare?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just
I
want to add
think,
one more thing to that, Vishak, if it's okay, from what Ellipses was saying. These were benchmarks from my previous life that we had around this, right? Um, an average operational cost for a claim that's manually pended, that has to get reviewed, is roughly around anywhere from $7 to $40, when you kind of look at it from the complexity and all these various different things. When that claim gets overturned, right, or it has the challenge to be overturned, that's where appeals and grievances come in. The cost of that operationally jumps to as high as being $25 to $181 for that claim. Right, so do that math. That's about a 3x cost. And the majority of that cost isn't because of the payout or the turning of the claim and all those things. It's the operations, right? Like the other interesting fact I'll give to this, and I was smiling when Ulysses was saying what he did because we use the Domino's tracker as like the great product analogy for everything, right? And just intake, transparency, and resolution. But when we did the analysis in my previous employer around this for how much to focus on this space, believe it or not, 2 out of every 10, so what is that? So it's a fifth of the claims, right? That or the of the appeals and grievances that were coming in were handwritten letters. So forget even faxes. These were things that were getting sent to a PO box, that were going to a mail room, that then we had a mail center that was OCRing this stuff and then actually going through the rest of the stuff. That's where all this 3x cost comes from, is in all of the operational legacy and debt we've created, which is absolutely the opportunity of where technology has to do better. It just has to, right? In helping
Agreed.
us with it.
Agreed. And I think, what we're talking about and why this whole concept of the fax machine is coming up is so, first of all, it's not really the cost, as Millen was saying about playing out the claim. It's really the cost is in the labor, the manual labor surrounding having to adjudicate that claim or figure out what happened to it. And why the fax machine is not going to go away, unfortunately, but it's going to be around is that one, we have HIPAA compliance, right? It's recognized as a compliance tool. And two is interoperability failure, right? We've had 2 decades of EHR adoption. Fax is literally the universal lowest common denominator. And it has the third thing, which is just network effects, right? With 89% of organizations still using faxes, you can't abandon it without losing connectivity to that network. But Alessi, I'd really encourage you to, shine a light on what Keenstack is doing with grievances and appeals to help automate, validate, and make sure that there's more AI poweredness to this whole concept of taking that manual labor out.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to attack, I think, first and foremost, where we started the product development was on what we believed was the most painful point, and what we had seen from talking to customers is really the intake. So again, the innovation being the fax machine or email on how these paper forms are coming in. How do you intake them? And then number one, understand what's in there. What do you have? A lot of the time there's a lot of very structured rules that you have to follow with regards to appeals, and not only what have you received from the member, but do you have all the appropriate document? Number one, determining, is it appeal, is it a grievance, right? Is it a standard appeal? Does it have to be expedited? I mean, things like that become really important. Even more importantly, does this member have a representative, right? That's kind of submitting this on their behalf. Are all of the clinical documents associated to this one, or am I missing documents that I need in order to actually say I have a complete package for clinical review? So if you think about a coordinator looking at what's coming in and saying, "Oh, I got 10%, now I got to go reach back out." These are the things that can occur agentically. There's no reason to have a person sitting over and looking at every document that comes in and determining whether or not, when they're looking at, has it ticked all the boxes that say this is a complete package that I need to go submit this for review. So that was first and foremost what we were focused on, and more importantly, starting the timer. Depending on the type of appeal it is and whether it's a grievance, you have clocks that you have to start, and you have obligations back to the government, right, with regards to Medicare Advantage, on when you have to turn these things around. And I think one of the interesting things that we saw is that just last year, 3 million, I think it was the civil monetary penalties alone, came up to be about $3 million, which was more than the last 4 years combined. And I don't expect that to improve, with the fact that, if you think about it, one of the numbers that I saw is that for the average for Medicare bonus eligible plans, that again, back in 2022, 90% of members were in bonus eligible plans. Now it's down to 62%, which means the quality of the care coordination has gone down. So you're going to see more and more of this come into your organization. And so it's definitely an issue. And that also lends itself to increasing civil monetary penalties. So anyway, the point is you got to do the intake right. And then once we kind of figured that part out, which is the product that we already have in the ServiceNow marketplace that you can kind of attach to, you can bring in and attach to your ServiceNow environment. Now, the second part that we focused on was the workflow. How do you take what you brought in, right? Making sure that everything is packaged up correctly, all the information is there. Now we say, how do we verify who the member is? How do we bring in all the appropriate claims data from your claims management system? How do we bring in the components or the elements that you have control of within your organization, so that you have what you need to provide the medical review? And then, as you move through these stages of the process, keeping track of who has control of it, where it's at, what their ETA is, and ensuring that the reporting and analytics are you falling behind on what your commitments or your obligations are for that specific appeal or grievance. And then last but not least, it's the quality of the letter. So after you make a determination on that, how are you communicating that back to the patient and I'm sorry, to the member, and ensuring that they understand why this was, approved, denied, and then having all of that data and analytic information available so that you can make better decisions to improve your process going forward. So again, starting with the intake, then building out to the workflow. And then the other thing is that I think we have to think about workflows. What we're looking to expand into is, does this require external review? Sometimes you're not, maybe with a grievance, or maybe you're coming for a second round. These have to go to an external arbitrator who's going to make a decision. These are things you need to be aware of. And I think it's important that you keep track of these items. And this is all part of the workflow. And like I said earlier, ServiceNow has been used in the IT departments to do workflow incredibly well for years. And so just shifting the lens into a business use case is not really a challenge for the technology. It's more of a challenge the challenge is really how well documented is your process today? Do you have systems that can be integrated with? And are you in the change management? Are you in a place where you're, as an organization, ready to kind of leverage the technology and not put your current process on a piece of technology and kind of shape the technology to your current process versus using the technology and what it can offer to drive a new improved process that can drive improved turnaround times, tracking, and output. So anyway, that's a nutshell what we're doing at Keenstack with appeals and grievances.
And I think the key thing to this, if I could just add one thing to what Ellipses was saying that is important for us strategically, that's Keenstack as well as ServiceNow, and just how we think about this. And I missed saying it at the beginning is the goal of what we're trying to do. We have a term for it strategically within inside of the payer space in ServiceNow, is be the backbone and the orchestrator. And so in a lot of these things, we're not trying to come in and say, take away this system and put it with us. Right? Now, there will be things logically that we'll have that conversation in as a part of delivering to this experience, as a part of giving you, what I like to call impact at scale, right? And really driving value at the end of the day for you as a payer. But in doing that, we know, like in the example Ellipses gave, there are systems of record, systems of engagement that we'll have to work with, right? That are surrounding this ecosystem, right? Including things like the core claims engine or your benefits admin system, right? Or you might have a system for customer engagement, right? Or member engagement, or whatever these other things are. We are not trying to come in and complicate that ecosystem by saying, take all that stuff out and move it on us, right? Because by the way, I can tell you from, being in this cost constrained, margin pressured world in this industry we're in right now in payer as a practitioner, even if you came to me and that made logical sense, we're not a place where we can make those kind of decisions today, just practically from the budgets we have and the way we have to think about these things, right? Like, we live with what we have and we work around that to do the things. And so what's important for us strategically in that spirit of being that orchestrator is to unify, is to connect, but through that, simplify and really deliver that compounded value. And I think that example that Ulysses gave just gives a great illustration of that for how we're looking at it for appeals and grievances.
Yeah.
I appreciate that notion. When you talk about the connectivity, appeals and grievances, as when I was with Kaiser Permanente, we also had appeals and grievances departments. I really want to get both of your perspectives on, right now it's a payer point of view, but how does it translate itself when you look at the provider side of that transaction?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. And Ellipses, you come from a provider, so you probably have better, kind of data points than me on this, right? But the one thing, so at Elevance, for example, we were always humble and reminded ourselves because of our strategy that our providers serviced our members. And because of the provider servicing our members, we were privileged to see the MLR and the cost of care and all those things, right? We were just really the broker of it in what we did strategically at the core of our company. And so one of the things we always did is we wanted to, get feedback, we wanted to learn, we wanted to understand with our providers the areas of opportunity. And this was one of those areas, the fact that we got from a couple of our large health systems that we partnered with Vishaka and Ellipses, you can probably fact check me on this and verify it, right, was in this space of denials, in what Ellipses was mentioning, right, of the low percentage of companies that actually want to deal with the overturning of that or kind of challenging it. On the provider side, there is a loss of roughly about $48 billion dollars because what happens is the provider just bears the short end of that stick, right? And says, okay, I'll either have to eat this up or have to work through government, kind of entities to figure out how to write it off or whatever I do instead, right? If I'm a non-for-profit, et cetera, instead of trying to actually recuperate the money, right? And so if you think about that cost on top of the fact that the provider's job is supposed to be focusing on the member, not all this administrative stuff anyway, we have just made their job a nightmare, right? By operationally not really figuring out the right way to collaborate and to partners on this. The word I like to use is circles of trust, right? As we kind of think about these kind of things. Um, but that's real dollars, right? Vishaka and Ellipses, happy for you to add into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw a shift more to these like fully integrated health systems, and I
Mhm.
call it payviders, right? In the sense that they kind of control both sides of the coin. And, it's at times it can be a little bit easier for them to, they know the other side when they're dealing with their own company's insurance, right? And then they're also providing the care. But that doesn't represent the vast majority of what's out there. I mean, you have a lot of community providers that are referring into the institutions that they feel provide the best care for their patients, but are also the most capable of actually understanding the needs and the services that they need to provide. And so I do think that for Medicare Advantage services and others as well, I think providers tune themselves to the payers, right? Or they if you don't think that a provider doesn't recognize like the payers, if you ever see the ever-changing list of insurances that a provider takes, they definitely have a perspective on the types of insurances that they want to work with because they know those are the ones that help with the overall care of their patients and move the patient in the positive direction. So I do think that it's a definite thing from the overall workload that providers have to deal with. They just again advocating for their patients. They want their patients to get the care that they're recommending. And then when you add this burden of, denials on top of it, I think that becomes a stress that not only the patient doesn't want to deal with or the provider, but then it also becomes, does a provider just say simply, I'm not going to accept that insurance plan in the future because they don't care about the patients in the same way I do. And I do think it's interesting. I did read that one of the things that has changed recently is that Medicare Advantage is requiring more disclosure of denial rates, right,
Mhm.
related to appeals and grievances. So this information is going to be much more out there that I think that providers are going to use to determine how they engage with payers going forward.
Yeah. I think what's also interesting, again, going back to from the product world, actually getting the chance to sit down with these folks. What we saw when we talked to a lot of providers around this, right, was there was kind of two tactics that they took if ever there was a need to approach this and actually doing an appeal, right? One tactic, the more popular tactic, I'll call it, because the majority of providers would do this, is they just look the members in the eye and say, it's your insurance, it's your choice. We'll give you all the stuff that you need to take care of it, but you got to take care of it. And they just put the burden back on the member, which just imagine what that is emotionally like for somebody who might be going through something catastrophic like an experimental, treatment for a cancer, let's say, right? This is not just like Malin trying to get an MRI instead of an X-ray, and it's usually more emotional things. Or the second thing, and these are like, I call them like the blessed providers, I would say, if anyone has these kind of doctors, you never want to lose them, is we actually had cases of where we would sit and we'd see a doctor. This is not the admin team, right, or the billing team, the doctor sitting for 2 hours on the phone arguing with the UM nurse from the payer to explain the medical necessity of why the test was needed or the procedure was needed to try to overturn that decision that the pair was kind of standing by, right, from what they made initially. And that's 2 hours they could have actually spent taking care of other members. but they took that time to go do this admin work instead, right? Because of how
Yeah.
this works operationally. Um, Now, again, if that's how we're treating our providers in how we do this, I don't think we'll have a lot of the latter. Probably have a lot of the prior. And it's really hard, I can tell you, because if any of you have ever had to call your insurance company as a member and argue about why the decision and why to overturn it, unless you're astute like us and you actually know the industry and you know the tricks and traits of the things to say and the things to ask, the common member will just kind of take what the insurance company says for what it is and then deal with it.
But they're
And
learning,
that's
right?
that.
But they're learning. That's the crazy thing is they're learn that 80% number that gets overturned, I think is insightful. And
Yeah,
that doesn't that like that's not going to get lost on providers and members. And I think the crazier thing is that we've been talking about prior auths, right? That's the 4.1 million denials on just the prior auth space. The greater Medicare
that's
Advantage
right.
opportunity 15 to 20 million denials and appeals, the appeals only represent 1% of that total population. Like my question is what happens when they catch up across these other domains? What Medicare Part D, what happens when they catch up with the claims and you start seeing those appeals come in? I think it's these numbers around, yeah, maybe it's $450,000 for an entire appeals process, all the way from the coordinator to the technology to the medical review. But if you take that, maybe the total cost for a prior auth is 212 million. Maybe the economics are barely getting there right now, but you increase that by 20% because of what you saw coming from 2019 to 2024. Now that number moves to just under 400 million. So this is one of these things where getting ahead of this is going to be really important. Otherwise, you're going to pay more for not having addressed the situation in advance because it's going to be urgent at the point in time that you actually get to it in a year or two from now.
Yeah.
Yeah, apart from the monetary and friction perspective, members and patients, it's interesting. They're the same person. It's just depending on what side of the coin you're looking at. But they lose. They lose first and they lose the hardest. And it's interesting to me that even the term grievances and appeals has such a negative connotation when payers really are trying to enable better outcomes and utilization and making sure the dollar is going to the patient, to the providers in a way that's the most optimized for outcomes and growth. And I think it's really interesting also to understand that the systems also lose in this because when you have friction is the cost control mechanism. And when you try to alleviate some of this friction through the faxes and the phone calls and the handwritten, you're missing out on the automation. And so I would like your perspective on what's the cost of doing nothing? I mean, it is a large shift going from fax to something that's automated, trying to prove out the value and return on investment. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I'll just add to one of the things you just mentioned, Vishaka, because I think that's important, right? Coming from having worked at two large payers and privileged to service them before in my time at Deloitte, we have the hardest job in the payer community, I would say. And sometimes I know providers will say the same, but I'm not dismissing that piece of it. In being in the middle, in having to make sure with the integrity, the quality, the trust that members and providers and also the government have in us, that we do the right thing. And it's a really hard place to be in, I can tell you that from having sat in that chair and thinking about all these transformation things, because I cannot tell you how many times while all of this we're saying sounds so logical, and you'd say, great, just turn the process upside down, throw away the fax machine, get rid of the mail, make everything digitized, become a Domino's kind of experience of where you would not imagine how many bad characters there are out there. And the amount of fraud in this system, believe it or not, is as high as in financial institutes with credit cards and loans. It's that high. And by the way, it's easier in medicine than actually there, not because of the checks and balances, but just because of the fact that you have to use one simple trick, like saying, this person's going to die without this procedure, and what payer want there on their hands, they're going to pass it through. And then sometimes we find out in retrospective and looking at fraud, waste, abuse that the person never got that surgery and it was just a fake. And then we got to go figure out how to penalize the provider, but also claw back the payment, right? Or you see that happen. There are so many easy ways to trick the system because of the business we're in, that it's not as easy as just turning the process upside down and fixing it. It's not. And that's why a lot of these, legacy slash checks and balances, they're needed because of that trust and that integrity and that quality, right? And so I think in answering your question, um, the cost of doing nothing is unacceptable, first of all, because the cost of doing nothing means we will continue to be, and it's funny, we used to look at this, in my product team at Elevance to see if ever it changed. Any survey that was done around trust in a company, and who ranked top versus who ranked least, health insurance was always the second to last. We celebrated if we moved up a notch. We were still down there in the bottom three, right? And so the cost of doing nothing is basically just continuing to not have that trust, even though what I just said is the fact that like our job is the hardest because we're trying to manage that trust. Clearly, there's a disconnect between the positive intent of what we try to do as an industry to what it's converting to in terms of what our providers and our members are feeling. And that has to change. The other part of this, and I joined this industry 25 years ago, and my kids ask me about this now too, but even sometimes my wife does, right? Is in the loss of hairs and the grays and all the bruises and scars of what we've been doing in this space. What keeps you excited? What keeps you smiling? What keeps you tick? It's the chance to actually make a difference to a person, to a country, and frankly, through that, leave a legacy, right? Which, yeah, you can be in financial services and make a ton of money and, do some great things, but you don't, I feel biased to the fact that you don't get that experience to leave that legacy behind. Um, and so the cost of doing nothing also means you have to be okay that you didn't try to challenge and work through an opportunity that could be because of just the orthodoxy of, well, this is how it is, so let's just keep it. And I think that's also unacceptable. Right. And then, yes, obviously there's all the, marketing pressure or the market pressures and the economic pressures and all that. We can go through more and more numbers, that kind of amplify the reason for the actual cost of doing nothing, like what I mentioned, right, on the 3x just in what happens and operationally for appeals and grievances, unless, instead of fixing that claim the first time, right, when it came through. Um, but I think those first two things, because the part that sometimes we forget in this, jumping into the numbers, uh, is the impact to the person, the provider, and the member. That's the biggest thing I think we have to keep in mind in the human part of this business, right? Is the cost of doing nothing is we continue to be the second to last trusted, and we continue to be the one that nobody wants to deal with, but you have to in these kind of situations, right? Because you're just looking to get that right medicine or that right procedure. Um, and that's not where we should be, right?
Mm-hmm. Alexi, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think those things that you hit on, Ellen, like it drives choice. Companies have choice, people have choice. Medicare Advantage, brought choice to how you procure insurance. Individual buyers on the marketplace have choice. And so I think that what you'll see is people will vote with their wallet. And if they have experiences that don't work well with them when they get the opportunity to exercise that choice, then they will. And so I think it's not just the customer experience. I think for payers drives not just the star ratings, which is reimbursement, right, and what you get, but I think it's survival. I think if you don't address this point, members are going to vote. Yeah, providers are going to vote with who they engage with, and companies are going to vote with their pocketbooks. And you wouldn't be surprised if you find yourself not having any members. So to your point, it's unacceptable because it's survival, and that's what this is.
Yeah. And I think that, You're both right in that the universe of consumer experience is setting expectations that healthcare hasn't caught up to things like Domino's and, what I can do to help in my health coverage appeal. That disparity is what's driving members away and what regulators are now forcing payers to close. And so let me just kind of bring it home with the couple of things, and then I ask Alexi and Millen to chime in. One is, consolidate. This whole notion of that process for grievances and appeals shouldn't be disparate, siloed systems or tools or applications. Intake investigation, decision tracking, regulatory reporting, in order for you to bring down the cost of the manual labor there, you have to reduce that down into a platform that's able to take and ingest data to be able to trigger these workflows. The other part is, staying ahead. CMS compliance requirements are tightening. Get ahead of them without all this operational drag of disconnected systems. And I think the point that we're all trying to make here is humanize, give patients, members a transparent, friction-free experience instead of just eroding it. And really, these are the moments that matter the most. And unfortunately, we're all caught in this notion of sitting in between a decision of payment, of outcome in a situation that already might be compromised emotionally for the member or payer, or patient. So with that, I'd invite Millen, Alevsi, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, ellipses, please. First, I can go after you.
I'm going to start. I'll let you take the business side, Millen. I'm going to take a technology side since that's where I spent the last several years. I think number one, diversity in your technology portfolio is the enemy. It's the enemy from keeping uptime. SLAs is an enemy from a cybersecurity standpoint. So the idea of having to solve this, when you do make the decision to solve this problem, because you ultimately will need to, now the choice becomes, do I stitch together, an RPA tool, a natural language processing tool? Do I integrate those all into a custom app that I built in the cloud, right? Now that I have to manage all my cloud security profiles, and do I have encryption in transit, encryption at rest? All of these things. And then do I have the personnel to support it, right? Because now you're talking five different pieces of technology that I've pulled together that all have different skill sets that I need to manage, five different contracts, and I need to manage that as an IT executive, as an IT leader, versus the other option. And again, for some organizations, that is the path that they've chosen, and it is a decision point versus looking at a platform play. And that's what ServiceNow is. The idea of a platform play is that all of those pieces are rolled into a singular platform where you can have one skill set, right? One security posture across, and you can deliver the same capability across that continuum. And again, I think the important part is we're talking about appeals and grievances, but these processes extend out to things like care coordination and continuity of care, all these workflows. And I mean, it's not, this is a starting point, not the end of the journey. And so the question is, are you going to scale the custom built stack across your entire portfolio of need, or are you going to scale a singular platform like a ServiceNow across? And that's the, I think if you run the numbers on that, I think find that if you don't have the resources and the availability to do a custom build, ServiceNow is a pretty great option for kind of delivering that back to your internal organization. So that's my technology perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just add to that, and I'll again, being a product guy, I love kind of examples, analogies. So if you guys can humor me for a second, I'll tell you a little story from when I was growing up as a child, and I promise it'll relate to the question, Vishaka, and the thing in hand. Vishaka's probably gonna ping me behind the scenes, like, "What are you talking about, Millen? What? Get to the point." But when I was young, and this will date me. One of the things I remember we did as a family a lot as family experiences was road trips. And road trips were really how we did vacations, right? Whether it have been, I live in New Jersey, so whether it be to Boston or Chicago or whatever it might be, good time in the summer with the family was taking these road trips. And one of the things I remember when I got old enough to help dad is the things that we used to have to do because the road trips were memorable and you had the chance to go to these places and have the experience in the car with the family and everything, but was preparing for the road trip. And some of the things, and this is where like you guys will probably get a hint of like my age, is remembering things like working with dad on the car and taking out the dipstick to check the oil, right? To see if you had enough oil or you had to fill it out, or checking the windshield fluid to see if it was topped off, or using a PSI gauge to check the tire pressure to see if you need to fill in more gas, but or to fill in more air. But on top of that, also doing things like going to AAA to get the direction booklet and the map of the states, right? Because that's how you got your navigation. This was before even Garmin. And then I also always used to remember, right? Like even when you're on these trips, especially when we were driving through 78 and going over to Chicago through Pennsylvania, there was always a road closure. There was always, some place that was congested with traffic that looked like bumper to bumper. And at those times, you just opened up the map and tried to look around, right, and say, where do I go to get around this stuff? But that used to be the experience of road trips back in the day. I was privileged. Again, as I mentioned, I have two children, a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old. My daughter, Nia, my elder, my son, Rian, my younger one, about 3 years ago to go on our first road trip as a family. And Malin was adventurous. We wanted to go all the way up to Portland, Maine. So it's a long trip from Jersey for anyone that wants to map it out. So this was, not one of these that was probably the one I'd recommend for the first time going with your children, but we were doing it to have some fun. Um, and I drive a German car, and one of the things when I got the car, the guy had told me was, hey, there's this app, and you got to download this app. And if it's going to do nothing else for you to be useful, the one thing it'll do is when you don't want to fiddle around with the navigation system and put in the address and all that stuff, and you're dealing with other things, just put it into the app here, and it'll upload it to the car, and you'll have one less thing to do. So, of course, experimental as Melinda is with technology, I thought, well, hey, why not use it this time? Because at least then I'll be able to focus with my wife, Charmy, and we'll be able to focus on the bags and the snacks and all that other stuff we have to do with the kids for this first road trip we're doing. I don't have to futz around in the navigation system while the kids are kind of screaming and shouting, I forgot the water, or I forgot the Doritos or whatever else, and have to run around, and I'll have one less task to do. What was interesting is when I woke up at 5 o'clock the next day in the morning, Melind was nervous. Yes, I woke up earlier than I usually do. I had a message on my phone, and it was from my car. And I opened up the message. I'm like, oh, this is cool. My car's talking to me. What's going on? And I opened up the message, and it went through this whole triage with me. And it said, hey, your engine looks great. By the way, your oil is perfect. Your windshield fluid looks like you might want to top it a little off because you're going on this long trip. Do that. The front two tires look like they're off by a PSI. You may want to go take care of that. By the way, it looks like you're going from here to here, and you're going on this trip. Here's 3 rest areas to stop at where there's also food so that you have the opportunity to do that with your children. And just to be conscious when you're going on this road, these 3 areas have construction. Here's 3 alternative routes for you to take. And the first thing I did when I was done with this trip and I went and I got to the hotel that we checked into over in Maine is I sent an email to my team. This is when I was at Elevance, explaining this entire experience. And at the bottom of that, the note I wrote to the team is where is that experience for us in healthcare? Because if we think about where we are in healthcare, the fax machines, the letters, the fact that, by the way, we still get CD images for MRIs, right? And our doctor doesn't even know the fact that we were at an emergency room and I have to be the one to tell them that. We are nowhere in a place where, like that analogy, that healthcare is a rearview mirror and it's just there to take care of us. It's actually something that makes us work. It makes the member work. It makes the provider work. It makes the payer, frankly, work as well, right? Just because of all the complexities and all these things that we haven't actually looked at in challenging ourselves to do things very differently. And that is what I'd look for us to have the opportunity to change. And that's what we're privileged to be really leaning into. Again, with partners, we can't do this alone in ServiceNow. We look at the opportunity of working with the ecosystem at ServiceNow is really changing the mindset, the hearts, the souls and really making an impact on those enterprises, Vishaka. And so I think that really sums up for me where we have this opportunity to make a change and to really dive in and hopefully do something that can be impactful.
Yeah. I really appreciate both you, Millen, and Alexi for joining us and really talking about what's happening in the ecosystem. We are towards the close of our webinar. I'd like to open it up for any questions that might be either in chat and or live. We'll give it a few minutes before we adjourn.
Thing, Robert, I'm just reading your point here. Sorry, just if getting rid of the least common denominator challenge for legacy. Yeah, I mean, Robert, I absolutely agree. Ellipses, you probably have more to say on this in terms of the tech side of it as well, right? But Robert's point and just the legacies tools and having that be the reason why we can't have digital native things that we can have for experiences. I mean, that's, I think, something we always deal with, right? I mean, we still operate in mainframes, right, for our claim systems, right? But that doesn't mean you can't have the opportunity on top of that to really look at how you can modernize and you can digitize some of these areas. So ellipses, I'm sure you have more kind of to say on that one to Robert's point.
Yeah, I mean, I think number one is kind of seeing, it's one thing to talk about it, right? And there's one thing to kind of see it in action as well. And I think, we're headed out to the Knowledge Conference, next week, which is kind of the big ServiceNow event. But if folks aren't making it to that and, they have an interest in seeing more tangibly how this can apply into, their specific use cases, those are obviously things that we're very open to kind of showcasing and accommodating because again, I think every organization is going to have a slightly different perspective on how they, address these problems, a slightly different philosophy. And I think that's important for us to kind of be able to showcase and kind of capture. And I think that's, sorry, one last thing. I think that's an important part of ServiceNow is that ServiceNow is not a one size fits all type of solution, right? When I speak about a platform, I meant that in that it's not here's how we built it, now go conform to how we've structured it. It's a technology that I think that has the opportunity to listen, versus it listens to what you say and what you need versus telling you what you need. And I think that's an important area to kind of get these pieces right that Robert was referring to.
Thank you so much to you both and for our payers and our audience out there. If you recognize anything in this that we described today, please reach out to us. Let us work with you and let us figure this out together. You all are at the core of the zone of trust between payers and providers and patients. And at the end of it, none of the systems or the constituents should be compromised. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.